You're listening to episode 128 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gert de Boer, Brennen McKenzie, and Doug Smith join us to talk about scientific skepticism and Buddhism. We've found that there is a wonderful alignment between scientific naturalism and secular Buddhism. Attitudes about Gautama's presence as a human and the constraints of that embodiment, the veracity of first-person experiences, and how we value the mutual support of community are rich areas for mutual exploration between these two disciplines. To serve as an introduction to some of these ideas, we're going to have a roundtable discussion with three active freethinkers and meditation practitioners. Gert de Boer studied philosophy with physics and mathematics as subsidiary subjects at the State University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. He moved to Switzerland, where he is working as a database programmer. Since 2000, he is a regular participant of Buddhist meditation retreats, mainly with Reb Anderson. He is engaging, sometimes fanatically, in the discussion fora of CFI, pleading for tolerance and correct understanding of science, religion, and values, trying to put them on the right place in the human universe. Brennen McKenzie is a small animal veterinarian in California and an advocate for a skeptical, science-based approach to medicine. He is the author of the SkepVet blog, a contributor to the Science-Based Medicine blog, and president of the Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association. Dr. McKenzie has also found Buddhist meditation practice personally helpful and enriching, and he has an interest in the pragmatic, naturalistic approach of secular Buddhism. He has been known to play the mandolin and the Irish penny whistle and to wear a kilt, though he does not claim to do any of these well. Doug Smith had his first real exposure to Buddhism in an intro course at Princeton University, where he practiced Zen meditation while getting his bachelor's degree in philosophy. He continued on to a PhD in philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, undertaking a minor in South Asian Studies, which included classes from a Tibetan geshe and several semesters of Sanskrit. An inveterate skeptic and secularist, in 2006, Doug got involved in volunteering for the Center for Inquiry, an organization created to foster a secular society based on science, reason, freedom of inquiry, and humanist values. He was made lead administrator of their web forum in 2007, where he still hangs out, chatting about philosophy, religion, skepticism, and helping stem the unending tide of spammers. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Lapsang Souchong, with thanks to our wonderful guests for the suggestion. And our guests today are Doug Smith.
Hi, Ted.
And Gert de Boer.
Hi, Ted.
And Brennen McKenzie.
Hi, Ted.
So everyone, thanks for being here. We're going to have one of the episodes that's a roundtable discussion for a couple reasons. First and foremost, because I like having them. Second, because this is a good group to have one with, just based on a lot of the email conversations that we've had. There's some really good topics for us to cover from our particular perspective. And third is that a number of the listeners have emailed in using the contact on the webpage and said, yeah, I really like those roundtables. You should have more of those. So that's what we're doing, and this is the first of a few that are planned. What I'd like to start with is for everyone to tell us a little bit about their background, and Doug, we'll start with you.
Boy, well, when I was an undergraduate, I did work in philosophy, as well as some intro work in Buddhism, Buddhist studies. And when I went to grad school after that, I'd actually started Buddhism before actually I went to university in high school. But um, with a little bit of meditation practice along the way, not really understanding it very well. When I went to grad school, I went to grad school in philosophy, and there was actually a question there for a while about which way I was going to go, whether I was going to go into Buddhist studies or whether I was going to go into philosophy. And long story short, it ended up that philosophy was the better choice for me. And looking back on it, I think I made the right choice. So I got a doctorate in philosophy. Meanwhile, I was doing a sort of a minor because the university or the grad school I was going to had a minor program. I did a minor in South Asian studies, which involved some studies on Buddhist philosophy as well as taking Sanskrit and so on. And I sort of put it aside after that because that is the Buddhism, because my exposure to Western philosophy and the sort of skepticism came with it. I sort of realized that there were a number of things that I had been sort of taught were essential to Buddhism, in particular reincarnation and karma, that I just didn't accept. Except perhaps as some kind of metaphor. But so I left it, always having loved the meditation experience. And a few years ago, I just sort of started up the meditation again, and sort of come back around to it. I mean, and then finding this stuff by Stephen Batchelor, who I had again read long and long ago, but reconnected with his atheism book. And then finding the website of your organization. I just think it's an interesting thing to pursue, I guess.
Right. Awesome. Thank you very much. Gert, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I started studying physics, but soon turned out it was not exactly what I was looking for. I think I had a naive idea that when studying physics, you're doing the most basic subject as a science that there is. I was disappointed in this. And, well, I would nearly say to understand my disappointment, I started studying philosophy. So I finished philosophy. I must tell also that I'm Dutch and met once a Swiss woman who's now my wife. And we decided to live in Switzerland. And without social network in the philosophy world and not speaking the language very well, of course it's changed after the years, I decided that I have to do something which I could earn money with. And that was database programming. So I'm now working as a database programmer. And philosophy and Buddhism were kind of, hobbies. I was always had some kind of religious feelings, but this religious feelings never came through the rational filter. So at some day I was reading Blackmore's Dying to Live, and in it she tries to give a naturalistic explanation of near-death experiences. And she gave it a Buddhistic turn. And for somehow this put me on the track. And I said to myself, okay, now there's no excuse. I have, a physicalist kind of worldview, but it doesn't mean that I cannot start meditate. So in about the year 2000, I started occasionally doing Zen Buddhism. At that time, I lived for a short period in Galway, in Ireland. And coming back in Switzerland, I started doing sessions, so Zen retreats, about once a year. Most of the time, I'm doing this with Reb Anderson. And I also once was in a seminar because I once wanted to meet him with Stephen Batchelor. And I already read some of his books, and I very like his secular version of Buddhism. So now I'm still on this track, meditating once a year for about 8 days in one piece, and for the rest, just doing my job.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for joining. And Brennen, how about you? Tell us a bit about your background.
Well, I'm sort of the classic dilettante, though I guess I like the phrase Renaissance man a little better. As an undergraduate, I majored in English literature and biology, and I was torn between the humanities and the sciences. I think deep down I'm probably better at literature, but I saw myself spending my life writing books about other people's books, and it didn't feel in the world enough to me. So I decided to go into biology, and I was particularly interested in animal behavior and field studies, and that eventually led to a master's degree in primate behavior. And I tried to make a living as a sort of latter-day Jane Goodall, but those days are largely gone. And along the way, stumbled into vet school, and so I'm a veterinarian by profession, and I am a bit of a skeptic, activist, or advocate. I have a blog, and I participate in a variety of other kinds of skeptical advocacy organizations, particularly centered around evidence-based medicine and alternative medicine. And I'm very interested in epistemology and the philosophy of sort of how do we decide what we know and what we don't know. And so in that sense, I'm a fairly strict naturalist. And in terms of sort of my spiritual background, I mean, my mother was a lifelong Catholic from, all the way from birth to high school, and a deeply passionate, committed believer by temperament, and then went to college in the 60s and discovered that maybe the world wasn't the way the nuns had always told her it was, and had a lot of anger about that. So I was raised with sort of the culture and the flavor of Irish Catholicism, but without any of the dogma. And that, gave me a certain mystical bent. I stumbled across Buddhism initially by reading Dinty Moore's Accidental Buddhist, and that led me on to Stephen Batchelor. As with a lot of the group here, I think he's a good entree into the ideas. I began practicing meditation less regularly than I'd like, probably 5 or 6 years ago. I particularly find Thich Nhat Hanh's writings really resonate with me in terms of Buddhism as an approach to living more than as a set of theoretical ideas. And I'm probably not nearly as informed or educated as Gert and Doug are about the philosophy or the history of it as a religion. I find it more a practice that has some interesting effects on my life and my attitude in a more pragmatic, practical sort of way.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining as well. And I'd like to say that one of the threads that all of us have in common is a positive inclination towards a naturalistic worldview. That is, not supernatural stuff, but how can we see what's going on in the world, in the natural world? How can we show this? How can we demonstrate different ideas? So we're positively inclined towards things like a scientific view. And as our first topic about this, looking at scientific skepticism in Buddhism, some of the things that we would want to talk about here is what your views are on things like, well, we'll just start with one, Buddha's omniscience and infallibility, which is something that I would suggest even many secular Buddhists see the Buddha in a very quasi-realistic light, that he's very much on a pedestal, and he's indispensable for the practice of secular Buddhism, and that's a bit different than my own. I was wondering if we could talk a bit about that, and I'll go in reverse order this time. Brennen, what are your thoughts on the infallibility of the Buddha?
Well, if we accept that he was a human being, then my automatic response is that fallibility is an inherent characteristic of what we are as beings, and I don't find infallibility interesting or particularly believable. A lot of the little bit of reading that I've done suggests that that's not a concept that's inherently necessary to Buddhism. I was actually reading a little bit of Thich Nhat Hanh's Heart of the Buddha's Teaching yesterday, since it's been a while since I've looked at it, and he talks about the textual history of the bits of the Buddha's teaching that have come down to us in written form, and comparing sort of various versions from various schools in the same way that one might compare, any set of religious texts from different subgroups within that, and looking at it as a set of ideas translated very much through fallible human beings and the random processes of history, and that it has to be reconstructed and rebuilt for each generation and each new culture that encounters it. So I guess I haven't run into a lot of people who present the fallibility of the Buddha as a necessary thing one has to buy into to get something out of Buddhism.
Gert, how about you, as you think about the character of the Buddha in a more traditional view of it compared to your own? Are there some differences there for you?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, in the traditional religion, it seems nearly that people need some kind of God. And when there is no God in Buddhism, it's the easiest way to put himself in the position of a kind of God. Of course, I don't see him like that. I think in his time, he was not the only one teaching these kind of things. I imagine that he was a kind of, say, a wise man traveling around. And I think that he made it in the way that it became a real movement. That I assume, this might sound like a little bit a silly story, but it's told about him that he was a prince. I don't know if I have to take this literally, but I assume he was born in at least an important family, and that he was leaving his nice circumstances in which he lived, becoming a wandering teacher to find his way. And I imagine that he already learned, say, the noble ways of treating other people. I think he was already politically taught from his father. And I imagine that a lot of people would say, "Hey, did you hear this? This Gautama has left his house and become a yogi." And I think that his charismatic person got it done. That a lot of people were following him, and his clear ways of explaining him made it that he arose above the critical mass, that it became a movement. But how do you call this? Fallibility? No, of course he was also just a man, and I've read the book by Stephen Batchelor, his latest book, and for me that fits more or less to this idea that he made more or less a social movement based on religious ideas. The religious idea survived, his social movement didn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well put. Doug, how about you? Tell us about your contrast between how you see possibly Buddha the man versus Buddha the something more than man that we see in the canon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree really totally with what Brennen and Gert have said. I mean, to me, I look at the Buddha as a person, as I look at ancient philosophers from ancient Greece, let's say. I mean, he's a very wise person who said many things that many millennia later are worth reading. On the other hand, you certainly do see, I think, within the tradition, I mean, not necessarily in so much of the tradition as it comes down in the contemporary West, but certainly the earlier tradition of the way they looked at the texts was in assuming that everything in the texts that came from the mouth of the Buddha had to be correct. I mean, I was just a few weeks ago rereading a book called the Questions of King Milinda, which is actually
Yeah.
it's a wonderful text.
It's an awesome book, yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, because it was written, supposedly between a discussion between the king and an actual king, a Bactrian king, I believe, in something like the 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC, I can't remember. A discussion between him and a Buddhist monk. And I mean, look, I'm not an expert on this, so I mean, I hope I'm not misconstruing it, but there's very much a kind of a play. The questions are asked, and the questions end up being the kinds of questions that people ask about the Bible nowadays. And they'll say, look, the Buddha said this here in this text, and the Buddha said this here in this text, and these two things are contradictory. He said X in one place and not X in another. And the way the text goes is there's never a time where the possibility arises that the Buddha just got wrong, or the Buddha was confused, or whatever. It's always that you don't understand what the truth that he was trying to get to you in this passage, and oftentimes they're the same kinds of textual games that you get with people when they're interpreting the Bible that way. And personally, to me, I think any of these books, whether it be ancient Greece or the Bible or the Pali Canon or whatever, they're all more interesting seen as human books to begin with, to me anyway, where you see them as the fallible outcome of discussions, arguments, stuff being made up after the fact, trying to find out answers to questions that oftentimes they really don't have the means to answer, but they're trying anyway. And that to me is much more than the point of view that it's that somehow this one guy had to get everything correct. Which I mean, to me, as a philosopher, that's just not. I mean, that's just not. It just doesn't go. But even bracketing that problem, it's just it to me is much less interesting.
And if I could just jump in for a second, my perception as someone who studied, neurology and psychology and animal behavior is that our ideas and our concepts and our behaviors are all generated by this little chunk of neural tissue we're carrying around in our heads.
Yep.
And that hasn't changed significantly over the kinds of time frame that we're talking about. So it seems to me that the similarities, the repetition of certain ideas and tropes in different religious traditions and in different philosophical traditions probably relate back to the fact that they're all coming from human beings and that we all have very similar agendas, very similar ways of viewing the world. And I'm sure Doug could speak to this better than I can, that I doubt that very many of the ideas found in the Buddhist teaching are utterly, totally unique and not reflected in the thinking of any other cultural
right.
tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which suggests to me that they're coming out of human beings. And what's interesting about that and why I think sometimes they resonate is because there obviously is a commonality in human beings, in our needs, in our perspective, in how the world looks to us. And he had perhaps the genius or the gift of being able to sift through the contemporary cultural overlay and find some of those underlying commonalities, and that's why his teachings still resonate.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and a good segue to a section of questions I'd like us to get to, which is, as we talk about the potential of Gautama's fallibility as a human being, then we go on to, okay, so certainly the rest of us are just human beings, and certainly fallible. So let's talk for a bit about the veracity, the way it's been put on a doc that we're looking at online, the veracity of first-person sense data reports. So I'm an individual, and I have a very, for example, is one for us to chat about, a very compelling experience happens during meditation or sometime after meditation in which I am either having an out-of-body experience or I'm remembering a past life or something like that. And one thing I'd like to say at the outset is these are very compelling experiences. No one's questioning that at all. What we are questioning is, does that mean it's an accurate reflection of what has really occurred, or might it be something else? Is there another potential naturalistic explanation that, say, even the Buddha as a human being himself may have been subject to, having a human brain? Doug, I'll start with you and we'll go back through again. What are your thoughts on the fallibility of the rest of us?
I mean, that's, I think, the deep question. And certainly fallibility becomes more of a problem the sort of the farther you get away from, as it were, the surfaces of the senses. I mean, as Descartes would say, I mean, you can't be wrong about the fact that you seem to be seeing a red patch in front of you, because there's an immediacy to that. And, whether or not we necessarily accept that, there are even issues there, but at least you can say, okay, there's a sense in which, if I say I'm feeling pain right now, I'm feeling pain right now. There are problems. For instance, there's the issue of the blind spot in the eye, where the what is it called, the optical nerve. Yes, the optical nerve comes to the fovea, the back of the eye, and there's a patch on the retina that does not have any sensory data coming into it at all, because there's no cones or rods there. And this is a relatively large patch in the eye, in each of our visual fields, in each of our eyes. And the fact that you're never aware of it, unless somebody brings you to an actual experiment. I mean, there's a simple experiment you can do to make yourself aware of it, but if you don't do that experiment, you're not aware that there's an enormous gap in your visual field. And this is an example where, even first-person sense data right in front of your eye, you're just not aware of not having. But I mean, those problems become even more exacerbated when you're talking about memory, and when you're talking about memory that gets very far from the present, and when you're talking about memory that gets so far from the present that you're supposedly remembering past lives. And that is sort of, at least in my mind, my small experience with Buddhism, that sort of is the example that they bring up again and again. If you're asking, what's the evidence in favor of past lives, the answer is, memory, and of course the Buddha's infallibility. And both of these are problematic, because memory is sort of notoriously fallible in many, many ways, and the farther away you get, again, from the present, the more fallible it becomes. Again, experiments have shown this. This is not a question, really. So, I think, and that also comes up in the question of what the meditative experience is like, of what sort of, as it were, metaphysical conclusions you can take about supposed meditative states. Are these states the same for everybody, or are they, as it were, is the experience that somebody is providing you, in other words, the description of the experience, is that actually being colored by what they're being told in the texts? So they say in the text you're supposed to have this experience, then that experience, and the other experience. Is this actually what they would get if they didn't actually read the text beforehand? Or are they, as it were, sort of spitting back to you? And again, I mean, I'm not trying to minimize it all, because I think it's I have done meditation. I love it. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But, there are questions, at least, especially insofar as you're going to take ontological, metaphysical kinds of interpretations of what's going on there. That's, yeah.
Yeah, as you're talking about memory, I think about, I just saw last week on television, again, Mary Lou Henner is an actress that we're all familiar with and have had crushes on at some point in our lives. And she's one of just a handful of people in the country who has a date-associated memory. So if you ask her, you give her a particular date sometime in her lifetime, she will recount for you, what the weather was like, what was happening that day, and this has been externally verified. And it's to see that kind of memory and how rare that is. Mm-hmm. And then you put in the subject of, say, a normal person's memory or personality when they suffer traumatic brain injury. and that it is, in fact, greatly, greatly altered. It is clearly very much dependent on this physical, neurological organ. And yet the collective consciousness that is supposedly the repository for memory, and that's what happens, in your transition between lifetimes, somehow that doesn't come into play when you're suffering from traumatic brain injury. Then it's dependent on brain. But once that's gone, then all your memories, come flooding back somehow. I don't understand how that works. And I've yet to get a convincing explanation of it. Gert, let's go to you. Tell us about your thoughts and around this concept of we as people are very convinced by the experiences we have, and yet they may not always be so. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think a very nice example of this, of my own experience, not in meditation, but I once did a hypnosis training. And I can say I remember a past life of mine. So nobody can deny I had this experience, I had these memories, but because I really had them. However, of course, it depends very much on what your position is if you take this as at face value. So there's always an interpretation associated with it. And I'm pretty sure that this, of course, was not a real past life. But it's, a kind of story I made, I fabricated under hypnosis, based on the feelings I had in these days. It's already long ago in my student's time. And afterwards, I have thought about it and tried to find, say, the real memories that somehow, created this story. And I really found a few in my life, and that combined with my feelings, of course, make me say, okay, this was a nice story. It was about me, but not about a real me that lived before I was born. Especially, I recognized a few movies. There was, I don't know what the movie is called. There's I find it very impressive, a movie about the only American soldier who was executed for, how do you call this? He refused to go into the war.
Conscientious objector.
Yeah.
Okay. He was already in France, and there he was executed. And actually, my story also ends in France, where I was executed. So, if you already believe in reincarnation, you would say, "Oh, this is a proof. I really had it. I had this experience." I don't deny that some people have experiences, and of course, it's exactly the same.
Yeah, none of us do. Yeah,
near-death experiences. As Susan Blackmore describes them, there is no reason to deny that the people had these experiences. But what they really were is, of course, another question.
Excellent, thank you. And Brennen, how about you? The human factor in what we report in our experiences.
Well, I spend a great deal of my time challenging people's beliefs in the field of medicine. Part of my interest is, as I said, in epistemology, specifically is applied to how we decide what medical therapies work and don't work. And I spend a lot of time challenging alternative medical therapies and things that I think are not validated through the scientific way. And that's led me to think deeply about how we come to know whether something we experience or believe is true. There's absolutely no experience, no medical therapy that's in use that hasn't been validated by someone's very compelling personal experience. And yet, I think there's an argument to be made for scientific approach to figuring out what's true and what's not true being superior. So I'm deeply convinced that individual human experiences are fundamentally unreliable in the sense that they don't mean what we think they mean. And the psychology literature is rich with experiments and examples of this. People who memories are not videotapes or audio tapes of experiences. They're narratives that we recreate when we remember them. And you can watch this happening in the brain, and you can track it in individuals over time and see how the memories are altered, like a game of telephone alters a simple phrase. And the same is true for our sensory experiences, decision making. There's a wonderful study where they put people in a functional MRI unit and asked them to make a simple discrimination choice, push the right button or the left button. And after a while, they can predict which button the person is going to push before the person themselves has any conscious awareness of having made a choice, because a great deal of what happens in our brain happens at a level that we don't have access to. So with that said, part of what I've come to realize is that there has to be a difference between looking at the veracity of an experience in terms of what it says about the world, the physical universe, and what it means to the person having the experience. I think, for example, if the measure of, for example, acupuncture or some medical therapy, if the measure that we're looking at is your subjective experience of pain lessened, then it makes no sense for me to say to someone else, that's not true if you think it's true, because it's an inherently subjective experience. And yet, if your message from having that experience is that, acupuncture is an effective therapy that channels energy through meridians and things like that, well, I can challenge that, because I think that's a statement about the world outside of your own experiences. And I think meditation is very similar. I don't think there's any point or really any grounds to challenge somebody's experience that they've had or the value of it to them. But I do think it's fair to say you may not necessarily be able to predict something about other people's experiences or the world in general from your own personal experience.
So that's a good way for us to chat about our approach in science to specifically meditation. We'll keep it in that realm for now. All of you are probably familiar with my having many scientists and researchers on the podcast who've done, say, fMRI studies like the one you're speaking of. And there are things around one's perception of pain, for example, or things like that, where we show things happening in the brain. But I also know that as skeptics, we're also a little more interested in having some more controls than we may have seen in a lot of the studies going on. So what I was wondering is if each of you could talk for just a minute about your favorite study, one that you think, yeah, that was great. Now, if only they could have properly controlled it. Or some of the things that you would like to see in studies that you haven't yet. Brennen, we'll start with you.
Well, the problem that I see in the literature looking at, for example, meditation or mindfulness as a medical therapy has to do with the fact that it's because, as Doug alluded to earlier, you can't know exactly what the experience the person is having based on their report of having it. And so if you are teaching a certain focus or a certain kind of mental experience and then measuring what effect that has on the body or on health or on behavior, it's a little bit of a challenge because you can't really directly verify that everybody's having the same experience. The intervention that you're studying doesn't necessarily exist in a way that you can replicate or observe objectively. So there's an inherent problem in doing those kinds of studies. And one way around that is not really concerning ourselves with the subjective nature of the experience, but simply saying, here are a set of practices or behaviors you can engage in, and let's see what happens when we teach that. That makes it more objective, but then in some ways kind of sucks the heart out of Buddhism, right? Because isn't it all about intention and attitude and that subjective experience? So I'm not sure that we necessarily can approach some of these things scientifically, or that it's entirely necessary. I mean, you have three fairly committed naturalists here who've all found meditation useful in their own lives without necessarily any commitment to a theory or metaphysics about it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Excellent. Gert, how about you? Tell us about your thoughts around scientific studies on meditation.
In general, I don't think they are very useful. I don't think they will prove something very important for Buddhists, for any kind of people meditating, because here it's the subjective experience that counts. What I see a little bit as useful is as a kind of public relations for meditation. It can show in some way that it's not completely bullshit to meditate. There is something happening. Maybe one day it will be possible to see that brains of meditators have changed, and that might convince a few people that to start a practice of meditation too. But it may be a little bit funny comparison, but for example, if you think about the proof of God's existence by Anselm, he didn't do it to convince other people. He just did it for himself, to say, oh, now I see it also a little bit intellectually. But it didn't make him more Christian than he already was. So I think that if somebody has a meditation practice and sees or feels that it's useful and that makes positive changes in his life, any scientific evidence is not very important.
Okay, excellent. And Doug, how about you? Your thoughts on science of meditation?
Yeah, I mean, again, I find myself largely in agreement with what Brennen and Gert have said. I was reading a book by Donald Lopez called Buddhism and Science a while ago. It's a good book. I don't agree with everything, but it's a good book. And the last chapter is about this topic. And I think basically, what he's concerned about is, look, what we're studying in the sciences is such things as does it help you relax? Does it help alleviate pain? That kind of thing. That's not really what meditation is about anyway. So, there's a question, if you show that meditation is very good for relaxation, to what extent have you shown, quote unquote, that meditation works? Presumably you're trying to do more than just relax when you meditate. And I know from the skeptic community that although meditation is not looked upon with the same kind of scorn that they look upon other kinds of alt-med, generally what they'll say is something like, look, meditation has been shown to be good for relaxation. It's been shown to be about as good as taking a nap. So, if you want to do meditation instead of taking a nap, then that's fine. And, look, I'm aware that we're absolutely in the infancy of studying this. And it's quite possible that in the next 50 years, 100 years, whatever, they'll find out all kinds of great things. But, for me, the important thing about my meditation practice is that I see it as a way to, minimize certain kinds of how should we say, useless kinds of emotions. Like, let's say, anger and greed. Perfect ones that they talk about in Buddhism all the time. Now, in the West, in Western philosophy, there's no doubt that those are emotions that are not looked upon too well either. The difference that I see between, say, the Western approach and sort of a very, very broad Buddhist approach is, in the Buddhist approach, they give you an actual practice that you can use on a daily level to actually make a difference to that. Whereas Aristotle might have said, if you act well, you will become a better person. The problem is figuring out how to act well in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not very much of a help to you to tell you, do good things and you'll become a better person in the future. I believe that. That's probably true. But the problem is the first step, as it were, and the steps along the way, the beginning one. And the thing that I like, or I found in myself that I like about the Buddhist practice, is that it does seem to be a way to actually calm down those emotions in a what seemed to me subjectively to be a very real way. I mean, I find them declining in myself when I do the practice, and I find myself understanding my own mental states better when I do the practice. Again, this could all be myself. So I don't want to take that too seriously, but it's only for myself. I mean, in other words, there's two questions here, as I think Gert was getting to. There's the subjective question of your own experience, and then the question of, look, are we going to look at this as an alt med? Are we going to look at this as the sort of thing that should be prescribed in a medical context, to people in a hospital or to people with mental illness? And then you need a totally different strength of evidence. Now, maybe the people who are looking at pain will eventually come up with something. Maybe people looking at relaxation will come up with something better, or just as good. Who knows? I'm not that familiar with it. But look, if you want to use it in a medical context for limited kinds of purposes, in a as it were, frankly non-Buddhist context, then great. But then you're going to need a higher level of evidence, and so that's my concern, I guess, with these two sort of approaches to the practice.
I would like to add something to it.
Sure, yeah.
I experience one effect of meditation, and of course I'm not a regular meditator in the sense that I do it every day, but I'm gone for 8 days, and there we sit about 7-8 hours a day, and all the things I normally do, like looking television, reading, and all the other things that amuse me or that have to be done, it's all put back. So in the most simple way, meditation, at least in this kind of way, is not committing to the urge to do something, just to sit. You don't need anything. And my experience is, if I take that with me in daily life, I'm less pressing, because not everything that I want to must happen immediately, and I can just say, okay, then I cannot do it for some reason. It's not so terrible. So it's not just relaxation in the way from getting a nap or something, but it's also relaxation in a very psychological way, that you stop really, I could nearly say stop the grasping, but in a very simple way, not in some deep
I think what Doug was saying, and what I think we've all been saying, is that from the point of view of a skeptic or a naturalist, the issue is separating out the fact that a subjective experience has to be viewed as or accepted as real for the subject, and that many of us have had subjective experiences with meditation that lead us to feel that it has some utility or some function or some effect. But we have to not carry that forward to say that subjective experience is itself sufficient evidence to talk about larger truth outside of the experience of the subject. So I find that there is a tendency for people that I know out here in California who are interested in Buddhist practice to be very convinced that their subjective experiences are useful guides to the truth of many things in their life. And that does tend to go along with a lot of these alternative medical practices that I'm particularly interested in. And I think that as long as we're careful to maintain that separation, that subjective experience is clearly reality for the subject, but may not be reality for anyone else, I don't think there's a conflict between science and Buddhist meditation. And I think science may have some interesting things to say about what happens to the brain when people engage in this kind of practice, so long as we don't sort of try to then use that in an inappropriate way as evidence for taking that experience out of the context of the subject and putting it into the larger world as evidence for something else.
Can I give one comment about the discussion so far? I mean, I missed the last bit, but one of the things that always comes up to me in these kind of discussions is that there's I mean, it seems to me one of the things that the Buddha talks about, and you find a lot in Buddhism, is discussion of delusion generally, of the fact that the human mind is constantly being deluded by the world. And so it seems to me, although admittedly I haven't seen a whole lot of it, that a kind of a skeptical approach to Buddhism, one that says that we are actually more deluded than we thought, about a larger range of things than we thought, ought to be able to find its home within, a relatively secular practice, because there's a lot in here that seems to me quite at home with, I think, what would, at least in my experience, are some of the fundamental kinds of tenets of the belief system.
Yeah, you're going exactly into the last question I want to have as a general
Sorry, okay.
one. So no, that's good. We'll keep going here with this, Doug. Is that what I want to ask each of you, and Doug, we'll start with you because you've gotten us going on it. Is we're all scientific-minded, naturalist, skeptic type people who have what we will admittedly call a Buddhist kind of practice, and it may not be the exact traditional methodology, but it is a Buddhist type of practice. We know that it is at least informed from that background. So where do we see that kind of resonance between our scientific skepticism and doing this practice? Doug, I'm right in alignment with you that I see no disparity. That is one of the things that appeals to me about this practice, is that it is pragmatic. It is something I demonstrate for myself. It is something that the effects of it on me as a person are externally verifiable from other sources. How about you? I want you to keep going with where you were taking us, Doug.
I mean, it's a tough question. I mean, I was trying to think about this thing before, and from one point of view, it's like mixing oil and water. I mean, I can hear that on both sides. I mean, I can certainly in the sort of in the echo chamber of my mind, I can hear people on both sides, saying what the heck are you guys doing? I mean, the believers are saying, that's not, we're not all about that. We're all about reincarnation. We're all about a certain kind of perfected belief system that came down from a perfected master, and you can hear people on the other side saying we don't want to have anything to do with something that has a religious background, and secularizing a religion is sort of like, a contradiction in terms, so there's, I can certainly hear that, and it's something that I sort of struggle with myself. I guess the way I see it is, look, you've got two things. At least I have two things that I come to here. I mean, I have the skepticism on one hand, and I have a sort of a deep appreciation for the little that I know about, a whole bunch of Buddhist teaching on the other hand. And the question is how to put them together. And the only way that I can sort of do that and remain true to myself, I think, is to say that, look, the skepticism comes first. I mean, the skepticism is kind of a background, a way of approaching all of reality that I could never, that I'm not willing to let go of for the sake of, let's say, quote unquote, faith, in some other belief system. I mean, the Buddhists go of two minds about faith. A lot of the times they sort of don't like it, but if you read long enough in the right places, you'll find that there's a lot of them that do, So I would say that the skepticism comes first for me. And that filters what I read, let's say when I read the Pali Canon, when I read later books like those by Thich Nhat Hanh that Brennen was talking about, which I also enjoy, particularly his earlier stuff. And if they go through that filter and I say, look, there's nothing here that I find objectionable, and in fact, there's stuff here that resonates with me on a personal level, and that I can make use of, in a world that's, no matter how much scientific knowledge you have, the world is difficult sometimes. Life is difficult. We all have our difficulties from time to time. And coming up with, in Western terms, what's a relatively sort of stoic way of looking at the world, sort of accepting the world for what it is, finding a way to make your peace with pain and suffering, is a very, I think it's both it's a sort of a beautiful way of looking at the world, as well as being one that's meaningful and useful. So, as long as I can find no contradiction there, I'm fine with it now. I mean, the stuff that we've gotten into a little of it, the stuff that we do have to throw out. I don't think that any of that stuff. I mean, and now I've read people saying that they can't. I mean, I was just reading a history of Buddhism the other day where the guy said, in no uncertain terms, he couldn't think of a Buddhism without reincarnation. And all I can say is I disagree with him, at least in the sense of my practice.
Yeah, and
I mean,
his inability to think of it doesn't mean that I couldn't think of it.
right, exactly. And he's coming at it from a historical point of view. And look, as a historian, you can say, look, it's pretty much everywhere in the history. So, if you're going to be that kind of historian that's really interested in the way, it finds itself in all of Asia and most of the Western world, I can see where he's coming from. But I also say, well, I'm not really concerned about that because that's not where I'm coming from.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. Well said. Gert, how about you? Your own views and your own way of your scientific skepticism with your practice.
Well, in my opinion, of course, it fits together very well. But exactly as Doug said, you have to throw out a lot of things that don't fit into a skeptic view of the world. All this karma and reincarnation stuff, at least in the traditional interpretation. What for me is very important, and that's one of my favorite topics in philosophy, is cognitive science, mind-body problem, and such things. And I see them very much in the same direction as my Buddhist practice. The Buddhist practice is, say, more or less the practical way. I cannot say that I experienced that the self, the ego, does not exist. But if you read, for example, Daniel Dennett, then it becomes it's a more intellectual way, but it's also it has influence on how one feels about these kind of things. So for me, it belongs more or less to the same project, which is, understanding myself. Maybe you would say the inside way, which is meditation, and the outside way, which is the scientific way.
Excellent. Well said. Brennen, how about you?
I think there are two aspects to it. I certainly agree with what I think Doug and Gert have both been saying, which is that to some extent, my worldview is a skeptical, naturalistic worldview, and I do have a sort of cafeteria approach to Buddhism. There are things that absolutely resonate, and my understanding of some of the newer developments in psychology and neurosciences suggests that the notion of the self is largely an illusion has some potential basis in reality, and so that resonates with me. And certainly some of the specific practices that are taught in Buddhism and their effect on my own, emotional health and ability to cope with life, those things resonate with me personally. And there are things that I look at and a lot of, for example, Tibetan Buddhism reminds me very much of Catholicism in its hierarchical structure and the emphasis in some ways on lineages and history and text and authority. And those things don't resonate with me, and I let them go. And I can certainly see how there are some who feel that that's not a legitimate approach to a religious tradition or a philosophical tradition. I'm a big believer that everything changes. I think the English language was perfected somewhere around the time of Shakespeare, and it's just gone hell since then. But that's the way things go, and change is how human beings are very short-lived, and our practices, our institutions, our habits all change and are reinterpreted over time. And I see sort of fighting that as futile. I think that's the nature of life. And then the second aspect is that not absolutely everything has to fit into my world through the filter of a scientific epistemology. I love the smell of jasmine and fresh cut grass, and I don't spend a lot of time thinking about why that is.
Yeah.
and so some of this stuff resonates with me and doesn't feel like I have to apply, my strict evidence-based approach to every little piece of it. And I think that's just a natural way that human beings live, and that's okay even for skeptics and scientists.
I agree with that totally, yeah.
I had some interesting observation once in my meditation that seemed to fit very well to scientific things. Well, if you practice together with 30 people meditation, and it's totally silent, and then at some moment somebody coughs very loud, and for a moment, just also because it was so silent and I was very attentive at this moment, and I was, I felt how for a moment everything went dark. It seemed my whole consciousness was somehow gone for a short moment. And I told this later to a psychologist who also belonged to this group, and he said, "Oh yes, but that's what's really happening in your brain. If you feel in danger, something very it seems something dangerous might happen. Everything comes into this flight or fight reaction, and so the whole brain is turning in some other mode." Which you can experience as a short break of your consciousness. So this is an experience for myself, and I'm not sure where I read it, but I think somewhere in Buddhist literature it's also said that consciousness is not continuously. We have the impression that we are continuously conscious. But in fact, it turns out that it's not the case. There is no continuous consciousness. There's breaks in it, and we miss certain sense data that we should have had because they really happened, but we just didn't notice.
Yeah, that is one of those delusions that we have that Buddhism refers to. That there is no continuity in that. It is change. That is the nature. There is nothing permanent. And that's a good thing. That allows for growth and change and new direction.
Yeah.
Excellent. What I'd like to do is ask two more questions. The first one is just going to be kind of an open, what is something that you would like to talk about for a minute and talk about it? And the second thing is I'd like everybody to recommend their favorite book along this topic that is not a Buddhist book, but nonetheless is somehow contributive or informative to what you're doing as a naturalist, as a skeptic, as a practicing meditator.
Boy, it's hard.
I try to come up with good questions now and then. Brennen, we'll start with you. What would you like to talk about that we haven't chatted about yet?
Well, so I guess my reading of Buddhism is that there are several primary factors that are involved. There's the Dharma, there's the teachings, there's the meditation practice, and then there's the community. And I found that to be the hardest part to access when I became interested in Buddhism and began doing meditative practices, because I do have this cafeteria approach, and there are bits and pieces that I take and that I leave. And I do think that there's an ethos or almost a cultural feeling to each group of people who are nominally Buddhist that is different, and it's been challenging to find a community. So I was very excited to find out about the organization that you're involved with, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what's the role of the community in a Buddhist practice from a secular point of view. If it's not just about having a tradition or a lineage to follow or a set of practices that you learn from childhood, what is the role of the community to the individual who's involved in Buddhist practice from a secularist perspective?
I think that is an excellent question. My own thought on this, as we look at the triple gem in traditional terms of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and we've got a figurehead. There's our hero. There's the example. We've got the actual practice itself, the teaching and practice, and then community. And that's, I will confess, that has also been one of my challenges, because I'm more of a loner. I'm an introvert, and practicing in a group is not, to me, as helpful as sitting on my own and doing the meditative practice that way. I think part of the value in community, though, that even I have found as a loner and as a also another cafeteria type person, is that it does serve to help fill in the gap in our own discipline in doing the practice, in having engagements about the framework that practice supports, that I don't always have in my own. Having conversations like this are very helpful. That's a broader interpretation of Sangha than in strictly traditional senses. But this is my community right here, talking with you guys about this practice and the guests and the people on the blog and on Facebook. That informs and helps grow what I do moment by moment. So I do see it is very much of value, but our interpretation of what we mean by Sangha as to not just being a reference to the monastic community, not just being a more Mahayana broad scope of anyone who does the Buddhist practice, but as anyone we encounter, because our practice has very much a social component. The right speeches, the right actions, the rights of the Eightfold Path. A big chunk of that is social engagement. That is community. So really anyone we directly engage with can be helpful to us, but really for those that are synchronous with our particular outlook, and it doesn't mean we all exactly agreed on every single point. We don't have to. I don't think any community does. But it still does support what we do and at very least remind us to keep going. Gert, how about you? What are your thoughts on the Sangha question?
Well, partially I agree with you that this kind of talks with other people is supportive. On the other side, I'm exactly the opposite of you, even if I am introverted too. But I would say, this is real English, a self-discipline. I cannot sit just on my own. There are a lot of nice things here in my home. Of course, there are my children. No, it's impossible for me. I mean, I could drink a glass of whiskey. Yes, sorry, I confess.
I got the single malt scotch at my desk right now from Japan.
Yes,
that's okay, brother.
Now you also know part of my taste. I wanted Lapsang Souchong, and I like the smoked whiskeys also the most.
Uh-huh.
So, if I want to practice, I would nearly say I need the social pressure of other people. That is, if I am sitting in the Zendo with 30 other people all sitting in perfect silence, I cannot just stand up and do something, and I'm supposed to sit there, so I keep on sitting there. So if I want to meditate, I have to go there. And to make this an intensive experience, I have chosen, for at least for this moment, this way of going every year for a week in a Zen retreat and then sitting there. Well, that's not special for in Buddhism. It's also the same with fitness. I have some lower back pains. I would nearly say normal for people doing sitting work on my age. So I should do fitness. I cannot do exercises at home. I have to go in a fitness center. But it's doing fitness, so I have to do it too. There's no other way. So. Yeah, the Sangha is important in this both respects, having exchange of ideas, but also for getting me disciplined to sit.
You're undermining the whole image of skeptics and secularists as iconoclastic loners.
Doug, how about you? What are your thoughts on the whole community Sangha question?
It's a difficult question. I mean, in fact, as Brennen just said right now, I mean, this is a question we have to deal with all the time as skeptics, because people say organizing skeptics and seculars is sort of like herding cats. I mean, it just And that's sort of why, in fact, we do the work we do on the forum for CFI, which is a skeptic secular forum, for just, to have that kind of community, frankly. I mean, there are other reasons as well, because it's open for it's open for anybody, but part of the reason is to have a kind of community. And community on its own, for its own sake, is useful. I mean, we know that psychologically. We know that in our own lives, that, having people around of like mind who you can bounce ideas off of is great. The problem that I have, as I'm sure many of our listeners and people around the table have, is that it's difficult to find a community of secular or relatively secular Buddhist practitioners. Zen is pretty good in general. A lot of people who, and I've found in my life, who tend to associate themselves as Zendos are sort of interested in a lot of stuff that is a little sketchy for skeptics, and sometimes that comes up in discussions, or, so in other words, as a member of a Sangha of that kind, I think a skeptic's going to be a little bit on the outside. There's also, a certain amount of just plain, not being entirely comfortable with religious entities of whatever kind, as a secularist, and so you're always sort of thinking to yourself, this is great as long as it's small. As long as secular Buddhism is a small website with a few people and, sort of a nice community, that's great. But once it becomes big, look out. It's going to be another thing like all the others. So, these are all concerns. But I think, for now and on a personal level, yeah, it'd be great. It's always great to have a like-minded group of people you can bounce ideas off of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brennen, how about you? Do you have any closing thoughts on your good question about community?
I think it's, as you said, this kind of discussion is an enjoyable thing to have. I spend most of my time with respect to skepticism talking about science and medicine, and it's nice to have a group of people interested in something that doesn't at first blush seem to fit with that, like Buddhism. So I haven't found the answer either in terms of finding a group, in my physical location, but virtual groups are a big part of the social world that we live in now. And I think that's definitely a place where one can look for this kind of thing, especially if you have somewhat idiosyncratic interests or perspective.
As we do. And what would be your recommended book that's not strictly Buddhist?
Boy, that's really hard.
Silence on my side.
You're next, Gert, so get ready.
Oh, no.
I guess I would say that I would, in terms of things that are involved in looking at delusion, because I think a lot of both my interest in Buddhism and my interest in evidence-based medicine and that sort of thing come from my growing realization of the unreliability of my own perceptions and memories. And I think the first book that led me in that direction, even though it's by no means the deepest or the most interesting in the long run, is Thomas Kita's Don't Believe Everything You Think. And I recommend it widely because for people who are not sort of hyper-intellectuals interested in philosophy like some of us may be, it's a very accessible way of looking at how our perceptions and our memories probably don't mean what we think they do. And that's a nice entree both into science and the epistemology of science and also into some of the ideas of Buddhism. So that would be one I certainly can't recommend highly enough.
Excellent recommendation. By the way, for folks who are listening to the podcast, I will do my best to have links to all of the books that our guests are mentioning today throughout the podcast. So take a look on the episode page. I'll have links to those. Gert, how about you? What topic would you like to talk about that we haven't yet, and what would be your book recommendation?
Oh, what we have talked about it. Well, for me, well, no, let's say you talked with, what was his name? Ellis? Robert Ellis?
Robert Ellis, yes.
Yeah. I've heard it recently just to get a little bit used to, who you are as an interviewee, and that it's an interesting subject. And he was talking about suffering, and well, it's said. So there's the first noble truth. Everything is life is suffering, as it is mostly translated. It sounds a little bit too high for me, in the sense I cannot imagine that pain will disappear, that mourning about people who are died will disappear. However, I think it is important to see it as a way of ending, and I called it then meta-suffering, suffering on a higher level. That is to make a problem of, well, the pain you have. Very often we glue some extra pain to the things that happen in life. And it's my experience that Buddhist practice helps in reducing this meta-suffering. Of course, you can say I'm not practicing long enough. Maybe it is the case that all suffering is ending, but at the moment, I'm tending not to believe that. Yeah, the same is with enlightenment, which I also think is mostly described in a way that is much too big. I call it a little bit like Immanuel Kant, a regulative idea. It sets a direction where to go, but it doesn't mean that there is this point you can reach. It's a way of, well, getting loose that can happen again and again during meditation practice, but also just in daily life. For me, the thing is important that those concepts get a little bit loose from their metaphysical content.
Doug, how about you? What are your thoughts on the first noble truth and potential release from that dukkha?
Boy, I mean, I think the main thing that I would talk about there is what Gert was getting at, which is that what we tend to do is make our pain worse by the way we think about it and by the way that we approach the world. And the way that we approach the world being filled with, the same things they talk about in the Buddhist texts over and over again: hatred and greed, ignorance. These kinds of problems that we have that are so difficult to get rid of only make whatever actual pains we feel in life worse, and more often than not raise new pain. And as I was saying before, I think that one of the things that I find very wise and useful about the Buddhist practice is that they give you a way of actually trying to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah, that's one of the most appealing things to me, and why I do call myself a secular Buddhist as opposed to a secular humanist, is that actual systematic practice component. The inclusion of that is much more relevant to me than having to set aside the unsupported assertions in a metaphysical sense.
Yeah.
Brennen, how about you? What are your thoughts on the first noble truth and enlightenment?
Well, in terms of suffering, I certainly agree. I think that much of our suffering is self-generated, and Buddhism is the clearest vision of that, and the most pragmatic and useful set of tools for coping with that. Again, one of my favorite authors is Thich Nhat Hanh, and the message that I get from a lot of his writing is that it's about our attachment and our aversion, and that our aversion and our pushing away of our suffering is part of what makes it worse. And so it's not necessarily the goal of practice to eliminate suffering, at least for the ordinary fallible individual, but to accept it and to sit with it and to not try to push it away, and to just see it for what it is, and to look into its roots and things like that. And just simple examples of that, I see a lot of people in emotional pain, because as a veterinarian, I'm with people at the end of their pet's life, and my early experiences of that were uncomfortable because death is uncomfortable in our culture and because other people's pain. I came from a very sort of stoic Midwestern Irish culture where you don't express your feelings in front of people. And I found that Buddhism made me much more effective in coping with that experience. And a big part of how I was able to be helpful and supportive to people was that I wasn't trying to act as if there wasn't any pain there. I was simply being in the presence of that and not judging it. And that has been a tremendous insight for me in my work. So I think that the idea of eliminating suffering, I'm not sure that I like Gert, see that as realistic. But viewing our suffering in a different way diminishes it and makes sense of it for me. And that's been very helpful.
And I should also say about what Gert was saying about enlightenment is also true, that there's a question really what enlightenment amounts to. And I mean, within the Buddhist tradition, there's also the idea that one doesn't really know about enlightenment until, I guess, one becomes, the level of the stream enter or whatever, which obviously none of us here is close to. But from an epistemological point of view, I mean, we don't really have any information about that state, or even if it's a unitary state or a diverse state, such as they say in the canon. So there's a certain amount of skepticism, obviously, towards that, as anything other than, as Gert said, sort of a general goal that one should head towards.
And I would add on to that total agreement. The challenge that I have with, say, an enlightened state is first, exactly what it is, not vaguely what is it, but exactly what is it. And if we say, oh, it's beyond words, well, try harder. And if it's a matter of, oh, but this is an experience, for example, we can try till we're blue in the face to describe the taste of chocolate. And I was faced with this directly with a friend in Norway when I found out she'd never tasted maple syrup. And I couldn't, there's just no way to describe it, so I had to just send it to her. It's an experience. So I get that. But that we're not able to even start. Just to say, oh, it's impossible, you have immediately stopped thinking. You've immediately stopped trying. That's the problem I have with that kind of assertion of, oh, it's beyond anything we can comprehend.
Well, I mean, but in the early tradition, there's a sort of a relatively simple definition, which is that it's the extinction of greed, hatred, and ignorance.
Right, which is a great way to approach it. Right.
Yeah,
they take me then to the next step of, okay, so let's say we go with that definition, which is the one that I typically go with is, okay, it's the extinguishing. Like, okay, great. How do you show that? How do you show that Bob now no longer suffers?
Or no longer has greed, because obviously it's not just greed, because I mean a quote-unquote enlightened person is supposed to want food and so on. I mean, in other words, even within the tradition they say that. So it's a different kind of greed than the normal greed that you have day-to-day wanting things.
Yes, how can we measure that?
And the Buddha could get angry. He got angry in some of the texts. So it's not anger, and it's not hatred in the sense that he can't ever get angry. So it's a different thing. So again, I mean, I'm not saying this is that I totally disagree with it, but it's at least a very, very questionable and complex issue, I think.
I think it's a very good way to put it. Gert, you're not off the hook yet. What book would you recommend? Nice try. You thought I'd forget. I never forget.
Yeah.
What would be the book you recommend?
What do you call recommend? That I should say that everybody should read it. I can. Well, there were two books I think that in my personal history were very important, but I'm afraid they're both philosophical books. One is the Wittgenstein, the Tractatus.
Mm-hmm. Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I have here the German version, so I couldn't say that. I think he very clearly makes a distinction between what one can say and what one cannot say. So now here also a little bit on this topic of how can you describe enlightenment. Well, yeah, probably you can't. And it is one of these nice sentences also in this book that the problems of life, when they go away, people cannot exactly explain why they went away. It's not just plain logic. If it was just plain logic, then we shouldn't need any psychotherapists anymore. So it's obviously not so as easily as that. And he clearly separates these two domains, what we can talk about and what we can't, and that what we can't talk about might be the most important. So the only thing I can say to that in this context is, well, go and practice.
Mm-hmm. And you said there was one other?
Yeah, it's Gödel, Escher, Bach.
Oh yeah.
I think you all know that, and it's not known as a philosophical highlight. I mean, I've never seen that you should read this as a philosopher, but it really helps in getting loose, your ideas. I mean, this one of the most impressive parts of it. I found the dialogue wherein the ant eater is describing his very good relation with the ant. What's it called in English? A heap or an ant state. And people, the other dialogues participants are very astonished about how this is possible. That ant eater can be a friend of an ant state. This is then very clearly explained that he is not a friend of ants, but he is of this ant state. Gödel, Escher, Bach is full of this kind of things, which make it somehow, for me, you can a little bit feel what it means that your brain might be just a mechanism, but seen from another level, you're conscious.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, Doug, I think it's your turn, correct?
I think so, yeah.
Tell me, what's the subject we haven't talked about that you would like to, and what book would you recommend?
All right. Well, the subject we haven't really talked about very much, which is, it's a very, I would say, difficult one from the point of view of a skeptic, is the issue of morality. Because the moral path in Buddhism is as important as anything else. And it certainly is a huge part of the Eightfold Path. Arguably almost all of it is moral in character. And, the question is, to what extent do we accept that morality? Do we, as skeptics, need to be skeptical of that as well? Or to what extent can we accept it just because we think, on a personal level, it makes sense to us? I won't get into all the sort of, metaphysical issues about what morality is, but, to me, one of the interesting things about the Buddhist approach to moral questions is that he takes it, he treats it, I think, or it's often treated in the texts, as another element of psychology, which is to say, if you're going to make peace with the world the way it is in all of its pain and suffering, you're going to have to start by, eliminating hatred. And by eliminating hatred, eliminating may be too strong a word, but by reducing it, by putting it in its place, you have to, the way to do that is to treat people without using hatred. Treat people with compassion. The way to eliminate greed is not to steal things, not to, that kind of thing, not to treat people as, in the Kantian terms, as means rather than as ends. So, there's a whole issue, I think, on that level that we haven't really touched on, which I think is sort of it's a crucial and I think fascinating part of Buddhism that I think any skeptic or scientifically minded person will also have to, I think, deal with. And I don't think it's something that's so difficult to deal with, in the sense that virtually nothing that the Buddhists claim as moral is really anything that's very strange. There's you don't have the same notion that one has to, pray to a single god, or not work on a Sunday, or that kind of thing. It's much more practical than that, and for that reason, I think is something that's sort of more down to earth, more acceptable.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me the things that I read in the ethical proposition of Buddhism, that it's not morality with the baggage of a religious sense of, not doing certain things on Sunday and other odd behaviors that don't seem to have any practical value. But what I see in the ethical proposition of Buddhism is things that are very demonstrably conducive to more positive social behavior, right, that are admonishments to practice kindness and compassion are things that we can demonstrate are not only of value, they do tend to have a positive effect versus the opposite of being antagonistic. But we also see this in social creatures. We see altruistic behavior in the animal kingdom. And
absolutely.
So I'm it's never really been something that I've seen as a very challenging discussion. I'm like, well, yeah, what's not, what's odd about it? It seems perfectly fine to me. Brennen, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree. I think that the moral or ethical stance of Buddhism is not stunningly original. It's very consistent with themes that show up in most philosophical and religious traditions. And my own pet theory, and I certainly can't claim to be an expert of this, is like everything else, our morality is generated by our brains, and those are shaped by the needs of our ancestors to get along with one another and to function in society and things like that. So I haven't had any particular difficulty. I find from a personal point of view that the emphasis on compassion and on trying to understand sort of the suffering of the other as the root of the behavior that they may be exhibiting, which you then react negatively to, has been helpful. That there's a certain emphasis on empathy, which I agree is a pragmatic ethical principle. So while I'm sort of skeptical of the notion in general that morality is somehow imbued in the universe or has some objective existence outside of, sort of the human brain and what it's like and how it's been shaped, I don't find anything difficult to swallow in the basic sort of moral or ethical principles in Buddhism as a secularist.
Mm-hmm. Gert, how about you? What are your thoughts on ethical behavior or morality?
When do we do a second interview? Well, as a philosopher, of course, I'm used to the nice sentence, no ought from an is. Mm-hmm. And now the funny thing is that somehow my Buddhist practice still brought me a little bit on this way, but it's not a logical argument, something, so I can now convince everybody that why on objective facts-based they should behave in a good moral way. This idea of compassion that Dag mentioned, maybe I should broaden this a little, sorry. When in the practice of Zen, as Reb Anderson presents it in his retreats, he tells about things that are good to do. He gives ideas, so as the Buddha probably taught them. And these are partially ethical rules. Now, maybe it's much saying that there was a German practitioner there that said, yeah, but you cannot fix ethical rules in advance. It's dangerous. I mean, I'm, of course, referring to the Third Reich. But the idea, I slowly discovered that if you get insight, maybe just a little in this non-existence of the ego, is that you are unprepared for it by some Buddhist practice. You might fall into nihilism. Or nihilism, how do you say this in English?
Nihilism, yeah.
Nihilism, yeah. But if you're prepared for it, and if you somehow get a feeling of this, well, call it emptiness, if you feel that this I is not that important, you automatically get this feeling of compassion. What my feeling is that everybody is the same kind of situation. Well, I would say more or less I described when I try to sit at home, that there is so much that is filling your life, and when these contents fall away, it's very threatening. There's, I would nearly say, a black hole in all of us, because we don't exist as independent entities. But if you feel this, then for me this compassion arises automatically, because we were all in the same situation, even animals. I had I had 2 dogs a few years ago, and I had the feeling they have the same kind of problem to fill their life, and what they do if it's not filled, they are bored and they have troubles with it. And well, we are filling up our lives with so much stuff that, well, in some way we don't see the others anymore. So for me, this compassion naturally arises, more or less, if you're prepared for it and practice meditation.
Well, I was going to go back to Doug, but I see that he just dropped. So while we're getting Doug back, and I'll come back to him in a second, I will bring up my favorite book recommendation for this audience, I think, is, well, one of two. We've mentioned Daniel Dennett before. Consciousness Explained is one of them that is very insightful about what we sometimes think of as our continuous self, and we see that it's not. The other recommendation I would make, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, is Thomas Metzinger's The Ego Tunnel.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of impermanence and no self and delusion. You'll find all of those very much represented in Metzinger's Ego Tunnel.
When will you interview him?
I would love to interview him. In fact, he's on my list. So
okay.
if you got an in to Metzinger, let me know, because
sorry, I haven't.
He's coming.
And I'm not sure if you've talked about this before. As someone who, both from a scientific point of view and from my Buddhist point of view, find the idea of non-self very appealing and resonating. There've been some interesting discussion of that from Massimo Pigliucci at his blog, and I found that very helpful to read, because I seldom find people on the skeptical side of things challenging that notion, and it's been helpful to me to look at that and see what kind of objections from a naturalistic or a skeptic point of view can be made to that concept.
Yeah, we'll take a look. We'll get a link to Massimo's blog on this as well. And Doug, we've got you back, it sounds like, correct?
Yep, got me back, yep.
We're back. You're just in time to, of course, answer the question on what your book recommendation would be. Okay,
yeah. Thinking about this, I can guess. I'll give two books, the short little things on each of them. On the issue of existing as independent entities outside of, as it were, space and time in a certain way that Gert was getting at, I think a great book is Dan Dennett's book called Elbow Room, which is just a super introduction to the idea that we have free will, but our free will is completely compatible with us being parts of a mechanical world, and that we get everything that we thought we could get from free will in a naturalistic universe. So that would be one. It's
interesting you bring that up, because while you were disconnected, I had recommended Consciousness Explained as one of
another good book. Yeah. And a second book, which I think any discussion of skepticism has to include, is Carl Sagan's Deep and Haunted World.
Thank you for bringing that one up. I thought you were going to mention it earlier.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I sort of feel like I have to include that. If anybody who's listening to the podcast hasn't read the book, and is even mildly interested in a skeptical outlook, that's sort of one of the places to start. Because Sagan has a wonderful ability to get everything right without talking down to anybody, and he has, I think, an openness to the general sort of, I will put it in quotes, spiritual program. Spiritualism is a word that raises hackles on a lot of people in the skeptic secular community because obviously it has supernatural implications. But I think Sagan is one of those people who is willing to look beyond those and try to, as it were, reformulate the term, or at least reformulate the enterprise, to include the natural world. Of course, his magisterial series, Cosmos, is just one of the, sort of, if anything, sort of got me into science when I was a kid, that would be it.
And in fact, I'm glad you brought up science itself, because folks listening to the podcast, I do this now and then. I throw it up on the Facebook page, but I'll put it on the episode page for this as well, is Symphony of Science. If you don't know what that is, go to the page, click on the link. You'll love it. So our guests today, we'll wrap it up, have been Doug Smith.
Thanks very much, Ted.
Gert de Boer.
Thank you much, too.
And Brennen McKenzie.
Very enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.